Dr. McCreary. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. So this is an interesting moment for me. I'm in the kind of nervous excitement phase. My book comes out tomorrow, so this is either the first talk of the book existing or its last talk before it's finally out. So it's exciting for me. I'm certainly always love to have this kind of moment, have that nervous energy. This was originally my dissertation project, and I'm really excited to be able to share it with you today. So Anthony already provided the Evergreen State College acknowledgement. I also want to acknowledge that this pipeline that I'm going to be speaking about today intersects numerous Indigenous territories, although my research is based on the unceded territories of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. And I want to begin by paying respect to the elders past and present of the Indigenous nations here and also there, and extend that respect to the descendants, future generations to come, and all Indigenous peoples. So today, what I'm going to be talking about, to give a basic outline, I'm going to start by throwing out my argument, and then I'm going to step back to understand the stakes that are at the core of talking about pipeline debates and struggles, talk a little bit about the methods of my research and how I approach it, then jump into the historical context specific to the Wet'suwet'en, and then talk about how that framed this particular struggle around a pipeline. So I'm going to be talking about the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, and really to understand how Indigenous struggle played a really key role in the fate of that pipeline. And then I'll conclude by talking a little bit about how we can understand this as an ongoing dynamic, a continual struggle. So the argument, to start. At the very base level, what I argue is happening is a kind of continuous cycle of struggle. So we can see, and we can start at whichever point we want to. We have our fat capitalist who's extracting wealth. We have Indigenous peoples who continue to assert relationships to the land on which wealth is extracted. There's a kind of contest between them. State legal processes try to mediate those conflicts to allow accumulation to continue to occur. That continues to be contested by Indigenous peoples, which causes more state mediation. So this is the basic cycle of my research. Certainly there has to be a smoother way to do this. So just to give a kind of overview again, theoretically, thinking about this, I draw on a number of sources. In thinking about our structures of capitalism, I draw on the traditions of Karl Marx, and then particularly on the work of Cedric Robinson, a black Marxist thinker who thinks about the dynamics of racial capitalism and how that ties to accumulation. Thinking about Indigenous peoples, I draw on the work of key thinkers like Leanne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard, who helped me think about the politics of recognition and its limitations, and the ways that we can understand Indigenous ways of being, Indigenous resurgence, as vital forces that push back against these regimes of accumulation. And then there's one more slide in between these. Then finally, thinking about regulation and the role of the state, I draw upon the work of Michel Foucault to try to understand the disciplinary power of the state and the way that that's renegotiated over time. So fundamentally, at the core of my thinking, I give all of that, but really is this thinking about the resurgence of Indigenous law and the role of Indigenous law in these contested struggles. So Glenn Coulthard, who was on the previous slide, talks about grounded normativity, this foundation of Indigenous movements in connections to the land-based practices and experiential knowledge that structures their own ethical engagements with the world. And then a kind of affirmative refusal of colonial paradigms of knowledge, of colonial dispossession, and a push to renew indigenous ways of being on the land that are embedded and enmeshed in this grounded normativity, this form of experiential knowledge and land-based practices. So this, to me, is really core to how we understand what's at stake in this cycle. Many of you will have heard of and thought about capitalism. We think about the state, and I think it's really central to think also about the role of indigenous resistance in thinking through all this. So the stakes here, the stakes are large. So the conflict in miniature, to give you a sense of what was involved, this is the proposed Northern Gateway pipeline is a 750-mile proposed tar sands pipeline. It was costed about $7.9 billion, so a significant amount of money. It was designed to convey 500,000 barrels per day of diluted bitumen, which is this tarry oil equivalent from this unconventional source, the tar sands. At stake for the Wet'suwet'en is the status of their unceded territories, 22,000 square kilometers of unceded land. And I'll talk about what that means. And at the core of that is really the continuation of their territorial governance and their relationships to the land, as I talked about. This matters because this is a photo of the tar sands. Many of you may not have seen this. This is unconventional extraction. So tarry bitumen combined with sand that is just torn up from the boreal forest of northern Alberta. It is one of the largest reserves remaining of oil and gas in the world. So 12%, 11 or 12% of global reserves are in this source. So we're talking about a major source of global energy. And James Hansen, the former director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Climate Science, said if we were to fully exploit Canada's tar sands, we would be putting the world at risk. Civilization would be at risk. If this sounds apocalyptic, it is. So the stakes are high. In the early 2000s, there was this major projection for the growth of the tar sands. That orange bar is the growth. And you can see the sizable jump in production that would have been made possible through new pipelines infrastructure. So the stakes of this debate are this projection for this major transition. This is from the National Energy Board of Canada. So the blue is, and the orange are both tar sands production. So we can see this sizable source and this massive projection. Now, notably, this is from the mid-2010s. So that projection of future growth is all premised on this new infrastructure. So the heart of this infrastructure is this massive plan for the Canadian economy. And of course, this has major climate stakes. And here I have this tragic, disturbing for me to actually look at. I was imagining that you would look at it. There's a screen at the front where I also have to look at it, and it's very troubling. But we can see the kind of impacts on animals. Some of my other research recently has been on tornadoes. Recent research shows tornadoes as well as hurricanes are intensifying with climate change. So this is a disastrous future that we're really at stake. So I'm arguing that Indigenous knowledge somehow matters to all of this, and the stakes are big. How do I understand this? How do I approach this? Well, I draw on the work of Palestinian intellectual Edward Said, using what he calls contrapunctal analysis. Contrapunctal, or counterpoint, is drawing on a musical metaphor. So two melodies resonating off each other, being independent but overlapping. So applying this to Indigenous community activism, I work closely with the Wet'suwet'en community. In fact, as I was driving in today, I was talking on the phone with some of my Wet'suwet'en collaborators. In fact, literally the guy on the screen, David DeWitt, was who I was talking to. And I work closely to sort of understand their point of view through participant observation, participating in their governance system, doing oral histories with elders, doing archival research, and also engaging in acts of reciprocity. This is really key for my research and for my ethical engagement. So here, this is my previous book launch. So I held a feast in the center of the community to announce and share that research with the community. So giving back to the community through my work. On the other side, I am engaged in critique of colonial institutions, and I read these, again, as this kind of counterpoint. So as I understand Indigenous and the richness of their traditions, I also look to the forms of colonial hearing or deafness that doesn't resonate with Indigenous peoples. And here, this is a court judge. We'll talk about him a little bit more as we go on, but Chief McCreary with his tin ear, and looking at the kind of inability to hear, but also the ways in which Indigenous activism tries to open up that hearing. So the historical context, so to give us just a sense of where we are geographically, we're on the West Coast now. Where I'm talking about is further up the Northwest Coast, just south of Alaska, on Wet'suwet'en territories. So this is a remapping of British Columbia as Indigenous territories. The green, do I have a thing? That's Wet'suwet'en territories. They're kind of in the center. This Tlingit territory is Alaska, to give you a sense of where we are. And what's really at stake here is an Indigenous relationship to the land. So Wet'suwet'en law and traditional systems runs through the hereditary chiefs. This is a quote from Gisteway, Alfred Joseph, who talks about each hereditary chief has an ancestor who encountered and acknowledged the life of the land. From such encounters came power. The land, the plants, the animals, and the people all have a spirit. They all must be shown respect. This is the basis of our law. The chief is responsible for ensuring that all of the people of his respect the land and all of living things. When a chief directs his properly, that's when the laws are followed. That's when the original power of that encounter with the land is recreated, and that recreates the authority of the hereditary system. So this is this traditional relationship to the land that's at stake. Now, the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en in northern British Columbia never signed a treaty, never signed an agreement, never ceded this authority. They continue to practice it. Each has its own territories. So these are kind of family groupings, extended family groupings, with particular responsibilities for the land. And in the 1980s, they went to court to assert that they had never ceded jurisdiction to their territories. It becomes the foundation in Canada of Aboriginal law. It was a significant court case, not only within Canada, but globally. It was this first time where Indigenous peoples went to the courts to contest, to say, our system of law remains in place, and we continue to have jurisdiction under that system of law. So this is Dan Michel, and he talked about, in the court case when they showed it to them, that people are part of the land, they belong to it, and they return back to there. The government tried to say, we gave you guys reserves, Canadian term for reservations, you guys belong on the reserves now. And he said, no, we belong on our family territories. That is where we're connected to. That is the source of our relationship and our authority. And that case at stake was not just this question of land as an economy or land as a commodity, but land as a relationship. So Needabee's Sarah Layton talked in the court case about our ancestors lived off the land. I don't want no money. I want it back the way the territory was in the past for our future children's use, our grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren, so they'll be able to use it the way their ancestors have in the past. So really what this is about the continuity of this ancestral relationship. Now the court case initially was very novel. It transformed Canadian law. At court, rather than leading their evidence with experts on them like anthropologists, the hereditary chiefs themselves took to the stand and presented their own evidence of their legal system and explained it to the court. The original trial judge, it would be hard to understate how hostile he was to these traditions. So in the end, in the trial judgments, he quoted Hobbes to say, Indigenous peoples, and I'm going to point this out in a very petty way, he misspelled Hobbes. But he invoked this Western tradition. Indigenous people's lives were nasty, brutish, and short. They didn't have the wheel before we came. They had no concept of land. We had to teach them about the idea of having authority over the land. They just lived off the land like animals. This was undoubtedly racist. And when it eventually got appealed up to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Supreme Court recognized that and said that Indigenous people did have a concept of land. They did have a form of title. It does exist in Canadian law. It is sui generis, a fancy Latin word for of its own kind. It's unique in nature. It's not something that comes from Canadian law. It comes from the ways in which Indigenous legal orders enter into Canadian law because they pre-existed it. It's communally held, and it has an economic component. Moreover, they recognize Aboriginal rights must be understood with reference not only to the traditions of Canadian law, but Aboriginal perspectives. And here they recognize that oral histories and traditional knowledge were a valid source of knowledge of Indigenous connections to land. So the strategy they made with the hereditary chiefs taking the stand and testifying, and those quotes I gave you before were all testimony before the court, that was a valid form of knowledge of their relationship to the land. And then they recognized that as distinctive Aboriginal societies, there was a duty for the state to reconcile its occupation and settlement of the land with the established prior legal rights of Indigenous societies as organized societies that were already present. This eventually folds out into a duty to consult and involve them in government proceedings. And this is the kind of vital backdrop for everything that we understand when the pipelines come. This is the context for the pipeline struggle. So what happens with the pipeline and how is this taken up? Well, the first way what becomes codified is these series of studies called traditional land use studies. This was a way to try to bring into governance Indigenous knowledge of the land. So what ended up happening with the pipeline company is they engage in these studies that I refer to as territorial triage. So for folks that don't know, triage is the process in a hospital where you decide which patients to prioritize and who gets to survive. And really what the pipeline company wanted the Indigenous community to do is identify the spots of most cultural importance so they could do pipeline routing around them. So they're like, we'll protect your lands, just tell us like your fishing spot and we'll go around the fishing spot, show us where the graveyard is, and we, at least theoretically, are not gonna go through your graveyard. It turns out in practice, pipeline companies are not as good at that, but theoretically, this is this kind of practice that you want to engage in, where they're taking them as routing constraints and integrating it the same ways, in many ways, that they would unstable land slopes that will slough and cause the pipeline to break. They bring it into these routing decisions and offer this form of territorial triage. Now, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, however, in the governance process, rejected this logic of triage, and they made their submissions primarily about the territories. So here we see the territories, where the family groups are asserting, no, what matters is actually the larger question of jurisdiction. What we need to worry about is governance and our authority to respect this land. So it's not about what sites we use, it's about our governance traditions and the obligations that are encoded within those. They also began to raise questions about the science at a more systemic level. So that rather than sites, they wanted to ask these questions, particularly about the kind of substances that were moving through this pipeline. The company and the Canadian government wanted to talk about bitumen as an alternative type of oil. But one of the things that was brought out in the pipeline governance process by Aboriginal interveners was bitumen is like a tarry substance that is in many ways quite distinct from oil. In order to get bitumen through the pipeline, they have to dilute it with naphthalene. Naphthalene is like a light fuel that you use in camp stoves. So they blend them together, and it makes the tarry bitumen liquid enough to get through the pipeline. This is notably why I use viscosities in the title of the book. It's this sort of play on friction because it's heavy and it's bitumen, but it's also Indigenous challenges take on this viscosity and really challenge it. And one of the things they pointed out is that bitumen, when it breaks out of the pipeline, the diluted bitumen splits again. The naphthalene floats off as a light gas, and the bitumen sinks. So as bad as oil spills are, all of the oil spill technology that we have for cleanup is based on oil floating. We don't have techniques for digging it out of riverbeds. And this has been seen in the few disasters that have already happened with spills. So they raised this concern that the governance process was not meaningfully taking account of science that indicated that this substance was something new that we didn't know how to govern or how to protect the environment for. Now, in the governance process, the other thing that the company tried to argue was that there was opportunities for new industrial partnerships. And they said, okay, there will be effects. We recognize you have this land title that we have to reconcile with. It has an economic component, as the court offered. What we can do is offset the impacts on your land, and we can offer you opportunities. Primary among these is jobs. We'll give you job guarantees to work on the pipeline if you sign on. So the economic component of your relationship to the land can become the basis for you working in pipeline industries. They also offered opportunities for Aboriginal communities to invest and buy a stake in the pipeline so they could get a share of the revenues. And what we see is this whole process of offering to transform that relationship to the land as a kind of economic commodity that can be bought and sold in offset, so that you get jobs, you get economic benefits in exchange for giving up that relationship. Now, this did not simply go over with the Wet'suwet'en. The Wet'suwet'en did not take this up. Now, I use this title with the weight of a feather in part because the symbol of Wet'suwet'en law is eagle down, eagle feathers. So they brought forward their law. This came from the very opening of the hearings over the pipeline. They entered singing a song that had been composed for the occasion. Our territory is our livelihood. Enbridge don't step onto our land. So from the very basis and the beginning, it was very clear. Now, the government chastised the Wet'suwet'en for approaching the pipeline company in such a disrespectful way. So the Sheila Leggett, the panel chair for the review process said, this word respect keeps being used by your Indigenous community. We've talked about it yesterday, we talk about it every day. Presenters should be respectful of all the parties involved in the proceedings with their evidence. So particularly, she's taking issue with the fact that they're singing and dancing and bringing forward these kinds of claims. This hearing is to listen to your oral traditional knowledge that you Indigenous peoples have to share with us. Historical perspectives about hunting for the berries, about the spirituality involved in going fishing. So here we see the kind of perspective of the government officials that sort of imagine Indigenous people still to be just kind of living off the land, not having governance activities. And this challenge about don't step on this land, the challenge that Indigenous peoples have authority is fundamentally seen as disrespectful of government process. So in spite of going through the courts, in spite of having their knowledge recognized as a system of law, trying to go there, when it comes down to these regulatory processes, still we see that the system of law is not recognized as law as such. Now, the Wet'suwet'en, however, continued in the hearing process, in spite of this chastisement about respect, to come forward, opening each day with the same song. And they came in wearing their traditional regalia. Now, this traditional regalia is significant because the regalia that they wear, each one of those animals symbolizes that original ancestor for your family group has a connection to this particular animal as representative of the spirit of the land that you owe obligations to. So wearing this regalia into the court, they're bringing in those responsibilities. They're bringing in those connections. And they began with a ceremony called the Sine. And in this ceremony, I don't have a picture of the Sine because it's a sacred ceremony. You don't photograph it, but you can see the rattle here. This is Chief Namox showcasing the rattle so that we could have a picture. And this is from the actual transcript of the explanation of the Sine, this performance that followed. They came in singing their song, and then they conducted a ceremony in which they spread Eagle Down throughout the courtroom. And they said, guests, the National Energy Board, Government of Canada, citizens of Burns Lake and the surrounding area. Burns Lake is the town in which the hearings were held. The next portion is very important to us. For every gathering, for every ceremony that we plan, a year and ahead, there's a ceremony called the rattle. It signifies the start of serious business of talking straight, talking in an appropriate manner. Along with the rattle cry is the feather, the plume. And when it rises, and it rises in a gathering like that, that means whatever is spoken about, that whatever is mentioned needs to be listened to. The feather is very sacred to us. When it rises the way that you will witness today, and the rattle cry itself is very sacred to us as well, it signifies the start of serious business. Now, this is important because the Eagle Down and the rattle are the invocation of Wet'suwet'en law. So in processes of reconciliation that occur within Wet'suwet'en legal traditions, the Sine is a ceremony that shows official business is going to be conducted and the terms of peace will be laid out. So what they're doing in their testimony is they're showing their governance traditions and showing what for them were the terms of peace with the pipeline. The terms of peace with the pipeline were relatively simply that you're not going to build it. So as Namox told the hearing, as a Wet'suwet'en chief, we are taught right on how to look after our lands, how to respect our laws, how to look after our youth, and make sure the promises that we've made to our grandchildren are never broken. We do not own the land. We're only borrowing it from our grandchildren. It is of the utmost importance that we return the land to our grandchildren in a better condition than when we walked on it. This proposed project endangers our promises to our grandchildren that we would look after the land, our culture, our people for them. We cannot break this promise to our grandchildren. So their stance is unambiguous before the court, or before the formal governance hearing, this pipeline governance hearing in Canada. Now, the story I tell you is unusual for climate justice, a relatively happy one. Initially, it doesn't appear that way. So the official government report, which was called Connections, when it was released, said that the panel does not share the view of some Aboriginal groups that the impacts associated with a project during construction and routine would eliminate them to maintain their cultural and spiritual practices. Rather, they suggest that the traditional land use studies that the company had provided, where they did this triage, they identified, was sufficient. That was enough recognition for Aboriginal rights and title, and that the panel is of the view that the Northern Gateway's commitments, and with the additional conditions that are put on to meet those commitments, the project will have positive net economic benefits for local, regional, and national economies, and can provide positive benefits and opportunities to local, regional, and Aboriginal individuals, communities, and businesses that choose to participate. So they said that economic component of your title is adequately compensated with the jobs, with the business opportunities, with the partnerships that you can set. So they accepted those original terms that are offered. And this is the then Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who announced at the end of the hearing process in 2014, we're going to build the pipeline. We've approved it. The company can go forward. That, however, is not the end of the story. Following the approval of the pipeline, Indigenous people went to court. The neighbors of the Wet'suwet'en, the Tsimshian, and the Haisla took a court case forward arguing that their government had given insufficient consideration of their concerns. And specifically at the core of that case was the insufficiency of their ability to understand what bitumen would do in the environment and how that would affect salmon. And they basically argued that the government hadn't and the company hadn't done the necessary science to even understand these substances and what they would do. And the courts agreed. They overturned the pipeline consideration, and they said they had to go back and do these studies, or they had to account more meaningfully for this. However, that's not just the story of that they have to come back through a technical, it becomes this larger political question. The Wet'suwet'en were always asking it as a government question of authority. And what they did, and they were part of a national and indeed global movement that pressed forward these claims, and they illegitimized the government itself. So what happens in the wake of their victory is that we see a change in government. And the new government comes forward of Justin Trudeau. There are very many critiques we could make of Trudeau, but on the claim at stake, this Northern Gateway pipeline, Trudeau comes out and cancels it. So it is actually a victory for the climate, where we see an Indigenous community of 4,000 people in combination with its neighbors, able to defeat a $7.9 billion project. So going back to that beginning, that there is significance to understanding these struggles. This continues to go on. There are more pipelines, more struggles. The government has grown more sophisticated in its techniques. I would love to tell you that this is all over and we've solved the climate crisis. Sadly, that is not where I end. But what I do want to end is that this cycle of struggle, this larger conceptual frame that I started with, is ongoing. So that those obligations that we talked about they continue to be exercised and they continue to be the source of struggle that challenges the governing logic of capitalism, of fossil capitalism, of racial capitalism, of settler colonialism. So before I go to questions, one thing I wanted to do was to move beyond my voice and end by showing you a short clip of one of the hereditary chiefs, Chief Killiset, that I worked with for the past 14 years, who sadly passed on just a month ago. And this is a video kind of tribute that one of my collaborators who does film work, Facundo Gastia-Zoro, made to recognize her and her contribution. And I think her words are a good moment for us to leave off the kind of formal part and lead us into the conversation.
Let's come back together, because this work that we're doing is very important work that we're doing. It's not for us. It's not for us to use in the future, but it's for our children. For our children's children, your grandchildren, their children, your great-grandchildren. And for those babies not yet born, that's who you're working for. That's who you're going to leave the end up to. That's who you're working for. My name is Violet Gallenbeck.
Very much, Violet. Thank you for sharing that video as well. I know Violet was a very close collaborator of yours, so I appreciate you sharing that and sharing her voice with us. I just want to see if we can maybe turn it over for a discussion now, talking about Tyler's broader work, what he presented on today, and I know some of you had read some of his other work in class too, so we can take questions regarding all of those things. But yeah. You can just open it up for questions from the audience now, if that's all right with you, Tyler.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Great. Anybody want to start us off, or?
Yeah, I remember a few years ago seeing videos of, Canadian federal agents raiding homes of land defenders, and there's been a history of anti-Indigenous violence regarding fishing rights in territories. And I think we can all agree, it's all kind of chaotic and fucked up. So, as somebody who's, involved in the work, and future for land defenders, given, we have our own thing going on with like the militarization of the police regarding defense of the land, all sorts of pipeline projects going on around the world. Like, what do you see for the future, like in the criminalization of indigeneity and resistance to that?
Yeah, so this is very real. In wanting to tell the story and wanting to, part of what I wanted to do today was honor Vi's memory. So I decided to tell a happy story where we can see a win. But as you said, the pipelines haven't stopped. The Wet'suwet'en have currently another pipeline that was forced through against their will, and land defenders have, from their nation, been arrested for trying to resist that on the land. So that's very current and very much related to the struggle that I document in a new iteration. And the question is so pertinent. So today, actually, Sale is in court. Adam Gagnon, one of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, for disrupting the pipeline. He had, the pipeline was, and I gave a little gesture out to it, the pipeline was about to go through the grave area of some people who had died in childbirth and had been buried on the territory. And as part of his responsibilities to protect those people, he had gone onto the site of the company and taken a loader and dug up the pipeline. Yeah, you can appreciate. The state is currently pursuing prosecution of him for trespassing and destroying the property of the company. He is arguing, I think, a very unique thing. It will likely go up to substantial appeals. It will be an interesting question. So his defense is that he was obligated to do so by Wet'suwet'en law. And if Wet'suwet'en law is not something that guides his action, then the meaning of Wet'suwet'en title is meaningless. That at stake in that court case was not simply little sites of traditional land use, although in this case also that was at stake. But what he's arguing is that for Aboriginal title, for these concepts to be meaningfully recognized by law, it means the obligations that they carry need to be meaningfully protected, and that he has a right to defend his territory from trespass. So that court case is ongoing, and that is his defense. So anticipate that to be a story that goes forward. Undoubtedly, it's a challenge to the framework of Canadian law and settler colonial law, a powerful one. And I think that's one of the strategies that people are using to contest, is that they say, our legal traditions have never been ceded. We have never agreed to be under you. Your own courts have recognized that we have legal standing. You need to reckon with our law. So that is at stake. It's also worth noting, in spite of the criminalization, the resistance has effects. On one hand, this pipeline got shut down. The other pipeline, it's called CGL, Coastal GasLink pipeline, has had to refinance. It costed it, I think, an additional $3 or $4 billion to build because of all the resistance. So this does have real meaningful impacts in the world in terms of whether or not these projects get built and under what terms they're built. So that's a part of my answer to your question. Although very much these questions are still unfolding. Yeah.
I'm curious in your thoughts on the difference of strategy and tactics when it comes to fighting against projects that are in the planning stages versus projects that have already begun construction.
Yeah, so certainly there's different strategies and tactics, and we see that with the ways that different groups engage. So in the planning process, some people have chosen to engage those processes because they say we have legal recognition, you have a legal obligation to reckon with us, and that you are still not substantively meeting that bar. And there have been various challenges that have had successful traction, including on the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, including actually even when they build the pipeline. I say the resistance is, and part of it's the blockades and the criminalization that's costing it, but part of it is actually very technical permitting issues. So the land defenders, one of the things they do is they observe the construction, they're looking at the effects. I'm currently in another project working with a student to help develop drone capacity so that communities can observe what's happening on their land. And one of the things that they've seen is that these companies are not upholding their environmental permit conditions. So one of the big costs that they have is they keep getting shut down for violating the terms that they committed to uphold. So I think that legal mechanisms that are often tedious and boring are also significant. They're significant sites of contestation, and often capital wants to extract at the lowest cost possible, which means that they often cut corners, and contesting at all of those corners creates space to really change actually the financing of these projects, to shift their viability. One of the arguments that people keep making is that, oh, we need to have oil and gas to fund the transition. We need these resources economically. And I think shifting the economics and the economic formula of these shifts the decision about how we actually engage a transition.
You got 3 different hands.
Are you pointing to me? Let's jump to another side of the room. Yeah.
When we're talking about the Aboriginal title in the Canadian system report, do you feel like in the West we already have something similar to that in terms of treaty rights, or do you feel like we need to go a step further? Like, who do you think is ahead in terms of legal power?
I think the Canadian and the American system are contrasting. So tribal sovereignty in the United States is a lot stronger than what's been recognized. So government, the Canadian system in its particular racism has been very reticent to recognize government status. What it has been stronger at is been recognizing a connection to the land. The United States system is a contrast in the sense that tribal sovereignty is in effect recognized, but tribal sovereignty is typically recognized within the frame of kind of capitalism, that you can be sovereign within a capitalist system, and you can have governmental authority, but the environmental connections are not, and the sacredness of the land is not well recognized. So I think in environmental challenges, Indigenous people in Canada tend to have more traction. In governmental cases, in the States, governmental arguments have historically had more traction. And then I'll jump over there. Yeah.
Is there concern in Canada that what seems to be like the likely fall of the Trudeau government in the next election cycle will trigger a new wave of like tar lands expansion and setting increase generally in fossil fuels?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in Canada and globally, the rise of kind of right-wing extreme extractivist forces are something that we have to contend with. Certainly we're in a moment of reckoning where the kind of promises of liberal order are falling apart. Their legitimacy is fading. And certain forces have been effectively mobilizing that, often in connection to a kind of politics of white resentment. And that's something that both we should be aware of, I would say fearful of, but also consciously mobilizing to contest. So what that has looked like has varied over time. And I have like a number of projects that I've been working on and have worked on. So initially my research was on the pipeline, and I was sort of documenting resistance. I helped try to publicize. I wrote like popular media, like newspaper pieces, and still occasionally do, to try to raise awareness. But I also recognize that my capacity as an academic has given me access to things that the community doesn't necessarily know exists. So as I've been working, I've also, while I was doing my dissertation, I found in an archive a film from 1927 that had been constructed by an anthropologist that wasn't available to the community. We repatriated that. I worked with elders to develop contemporary educational programming to go with the film so they could use it in the schools. So to support that work on the ground and recognize the ways that this kind of intimately works. My very first book was, I did this as my dissertation research a decade ago, but I ended up, when I presented my dissertation research to the community, Violet actually took me aside and said, okay, now you've done that, what I want you to do next is tell the story of my family in town and what happened to them in this northern resource town. And what I ended up doing and what I ended up engaging with is, was unknown to me, but the neighborhood that I had grown up in was an indigenous community in the early days of the town. And they had been burned out in the 50s and 60s. And so I told this story, and I worked with these elders to tell the story of the house that I grew up in and its relationship to their families. So at the same time as I'm doing this broader work that looks at these kind of political struggles and I try to publicize it, I'm also really attentive to these kind of interpersonal obligations and connections.
So I guess my question is about reimagining and being able to reimagine our relations. And I'm just curious from your insight, like how do you think we can reimagine our relations beyond survival or beyond like the settler colonial law?
Yeah. So I think this is really, really important. And part of the conversation that I was having this morning was looking at the legacies of this. And I think we should recognize our communities, and I speak broadly there, of settler communities, of recent immigrant communities, and indigenous communities, are all struggling with a degree of unhealthiness. We see that in the opioid crisis, we see that in the fentanyl crisis, and even to give credence to some of the feelings, the anger that people have, there's something unhappy and unhealthy about where we're at. And I think it's important for us to start by saying, this is not working. I I also think that it's important to recognize that the reimagining that we're doing is not always reimagining. In some ways, it's actually returning to things that have been silenced, to voices that have been excluded, that still have forms of knowledge that we can turn to. So you talked a little bit about the land defenders, my colleague, in the first question. Now, it's important that land defenders aren't just about resisting projects. So the Unistoten camp, which is one of the Wet'suwet'en resistant camps, is important because not only are they resisting, but they actually built a healing center there. So at the core of the resistance is about restoring the relationship to the land. And they have their kind of director of Tate, I'm blanking on her name, Carla Tate, who talks about the importance that they built this wellness center on the land, actually at the site where originally the pipeline was supposed to cross the river, which was showing occupation, was showing their connection to the land, but it also was about healing that connection to the land, about dealing with the effects of things like residential schools, of addictions, and all of the violence that got internalized in the community, and serving as a model of the role that like reconnecting with the land can have in restoring health and function within the community.
I don't know if I have like my question fully put out, but if you're picking up what I'm putting down.
Yeah, no, so I mean, I think that there's like both. I mean, we have to deal with like the questions of invalidations to be like, oh, you're not well. And this like kind of casting back that it's like, oh, the illness is you. I mean, on one hand, my simplest thing is like, I want to reject that. That's ridiculous. But also, I think that we need to talk about, like, yes, it's not just me. Like, anxiety is at like acute levels. One of the things that we could say that we've learned from the coronavirus is that a lot of people don't trust pharmaceutical companies. There are some valid reasons for that. And it turns out, I think the drugs are not curing us on their own. I mean, personally, I would recommend getting vaccinated for the coronavirus, but I would say, you know, Prozac wasn't the cure, Valium wasn't the cure. Like, we're continuing to have like these social anxieties. And increasingly, I have a colleague who's doing research right now on the problem of climate anxiety. The kind of doom scenarios that people face are medically recognizably creating trauma in communities. The kind of ongoing and intensifying crises, whether it be wildfires or hurricanes or tornadoes, have disastrous economic consequences, but are also tearing at the kind of mental fabric of communities. It really does pull apart a community, not just physical infrastructure, but also the social infrastructure that people are struggling with. And I think when people push that back, I think that it's important to recognize that this is not an individual problem. Like, we have a societal level kind of malfunction. And in many cases, the first stage of healing is recognizing what hurts you. We can't start really functioning and healing until we see what the hurt is coming from. You know, you have to name the poison. And I think that's part of where we start that kind of conversation. This is naming the poison. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I've been thinking about normativity a bit actually lately. And if we look at kind of the history of discourses around normativity, one of the things we can recognize, and I think it goes back to the Kinsey studies in the 60s around sexuality, is not very many of us are really normal in terms of, and one useful starting point is to recognize there are relatively few, like I think some bankers and lawyers maybe are feeling like this is a normal and good system, but most of us are not feeling like we really fit. Like the pressures that we face, I would say in this particular moment are fragmenting us as people. Like we're pushed into all of these roles. We're working jobs that in many cases we hate. They're not rejuvenating us. A few people have jobs. Part of my job I feel like deeply loving. University administration is the fracturing part. But we can have to recognize that we are actually the many, that the norm is not actually, the norm is an ideal, but it's not a condition that actually most of us feel, and that those ideals are falsehoods. Yeah.
I was wondering if you've thought about how we can avoid exploitation of Indigenous communities when it comes to this burden of trying to heal or bring back hope.
Yeah.
So that it's not all put on Indigenous.
Yeah, so this is something that actually I've been talking and thinking about. So I have a colleague who is working in Australia with Indigenous communities there, and we were talking last week, and he used this metaphor of a truck. So, and it's the metaphor that the community he works with likes to use, but that they had a nice truck. It was running well. White people or settlers borrowed the truck and really beat it up. And now it's not working, and we're like, in some cases, suggesting that maybe we'll give you the keys back and you can show us how to drive it correctly now that it's broken. And that's not really fair as an expectation. Although, when I was talking, and I followed this up after that conversation, sharing the same conversation with David, actually, David DeWitt, and David was like, yeah, no, this is like really real, the trauma that we face, but he was also, we need to reconnect to the land because that's the only way we're gonna heal. And he's like, it's totally unfair. It's totally unfair, this burden. But also, you need to give us the keys because you're not driving safely. And so he was like kind of unapologetic. He's like, we need this for our communities. He's like, we're dying. And it's not fair, but at the same time, we need to recognize a role for Indigenous people. Now, the other thing that he said about that was that there's a question of redistribution. So it's not just, oh, we give you the keys, but also we redistribute some of the resources that we've taken from you so that you can fix the truck. And I think it's really important that we recognize that a lot of resources have been extracted without wealth redistribution. And he's not saying we need to have continued pipelines to have the wealth redistribution. He's like, the resources have been taken. There's a debt. Part of the West Coast societies I work with, and I think the societies here too, are gifting societies. And in a gift, you need to reciprocate. You've taken. Capitalism is really good at taking gifts, not so good at giving back. And I think it's important to have that giving back. And I think you raise a really important thing. Is like, we're not just giving you the authority to, or obligation to fix it. We also have to reciprocate what we've been taking. And that's part of that process. Yeah.
So you mentioned this a little bit in passing about your role as a faculty member, as a professor. And
Yeah.
I wondered if you could contextualize that a little bit, either teaching and learning within the state of Florida in this particular moment, and talking about settler colonialism and racial capitalism within the context of Florida.
Yeah. So. I've definitely, so this is a negotiation. I have split loyalties. I'll say, so I grew up on Wet'suwet'en territory, and I always have a sense of obligation back home. So one of the things that I've done in my teaching is often I make sure always that we talk about colonialism in class. I think it's important to include Indigenous voices on the syllabus, so that we're hearing from that. Often this is a forgotten part of education in Florida. In the Southeast, there is often a kind of relegation of Indigenous peoples to the past. And I think it's really an obligation to reintroduce that. I would say people are not aware, but there's not the same active hostility in that regard. There's an openness to learning, and I feel partly like decolonial education has to engage these moments of ignorance. So that's part of my work. And then also at Florida State, I have, in the midst of this environment, this is the first year, shockingly, that we formed a Native American and Indigenous Studies Center on campus. So institutionalizing and recognizing those forms of knowledge that have been long neglected. And this is work that we're doing in the midst of what can be construed as a hostile climate. At the other side, I am in Florida, and I recognize there's also other struggles there that I have ethical obligations to. So I've been working with historically Black communities in Florida to try to document their issues. I've brought that into the classroom as well. I'm relatively unapologetic about the fact that we need to talk about these issues. I think that we have academic freedom and we need to exercise it and not police ourselves to not speak about the pressing issues of our day. I would be dishonest if I said there haven't been pressures or repercussions. If you care to Google, there's an article in the on ProPublic or The Atlantic that was about me and some other faculty and the struggles that we've faced. So I've also been open talking about that, talking about this. But I would say some things have actually been really positive in a strange way. So one of the things that they've sort of come after us to sort of say is like, oh, you're indoctrinating students. And I've been taking my classes to sort of take this as a challenge to sort of say, well, I'm not intending to indoctrinate. I want people to engage these issues. I believe in democracy. I believe that if we're going to ever come out of this, we have to collectively engage. So I've taken my classes and tried to invert them increasingly. So rather than me talking at people, we do more discussion. We read and literally have read some of these pipeline documents and sort of said, well, how would you analyze what the government is doing? And it turns out, counter to the kind of perspectives we might be hearing politically, the vast majority of students I encounter are entirely capable of independent critical thought.
I just know this because I toured FSU and it was a potential school for me to go to. Has there been discussion around changing the mascot?
So there has been discussion about changing the ways we represent. So currently, within the NCAA, it's you have to have tribal support. The Seminole tribe of Florida has given their permission, but what we're doing is changing slowly some of the surrounding things. So for instance, and I think you guys have a beach site for your campus. FSU also has one. It was until 2 or 3 years ago called the Res, which is really unfortunate. That site has now been renamed. We have taken the scalpum, scalpum, scalpum part out of our chant. Again, yeah, it's a, they're, which I think are steps. And I think there's an ongoing discussion, but it's been really slow. Like this is the first year of existence of Native American Indigenous Studies, which we got the approval of the Board of Governors for. We also got the Board of Governors to have their first meeting on Seminole territory, which is when they were introduced the idea that we were going to create this, which was a very appropriate place. And they unanimously endorsed it in that context. So I think that we are really kind of working to make change. I think there are people that are aware of the issue, but it's not happening as fast as, but I mean, this is by the same token, on the opposite side, Epps, who was the original landowner that bequeathed the university, a descendant of Jefferson and a slave owner. It took a long time for us to get the campus to remove his statue, but we have. And I think that the lesson is dual. There is a lot of work to do, but also there's a lot of opportunity for us to make change. And in spite of how dark things look, one of the things about the future is it's unknown, and there's potential in that for it to be different than what we know. Can you, I didn't catch which project you were.
The Willow project is in Alaska.
Okay, to be honest, I don't know.
Okay.
Thinking about the court case or the courtroom
Yeah.
and the use of,
Yeah.
Paraphernalia and all of that, not all of that to be dismissive, but have you noticed an undercurrent of like pretty strong creativity in the resistance, and in what other ways? And are there any intersections also with queerness that you're seeing, especially in Florida?
Yeah, so I'm going to take those as two, and we'll see.
Yeah,
They weave, but so one of the things that's interesting to me, I haven't written about this, but I think is really fascinating. So Gasteiwe, I was the lead Wet'suwet'en plaintiff in the court case. That court case began in 84. Gasteiwe, before the court case, he's a carver, or was a carver. He passed a few years ago. Gasteiwe was part of creating the first First Nations-controlled carving school and the first First Nations or Indigenous-controlled museum in Canada in the 70s. So the rejuvenation of these traditional practices is intimately tied. So from the origins of the kind of contemporary movement, that we can trace cultural resurgence as in some cases preceding, but operating alongside. So it's not one or the other, but I think often the creativity is core to these movements, and is core to being able to express these kind of connections and speak to that resurgent element that often gets lost in the politics of resistance. It's not just about resistance. In terms of sexual politics, so it has been within the Wet'suwet'en president, so there has traditionally, coming from residential schools in these histories, been kind of deeply entrenched heteropatriarchy, but we see negotiations. So for instance, they have women's camps. Part of the cultural revitalization is working through the community, and they had, as part of cultural revitalization, set up women's camps and men's camps. They have a couple years ago switched to allowing them to not be defined by born, but by identification. So there's kind of opening up these spaces to recognize gender is more fluid. And so those conversations are cutting through, and a number of the kind of leading figures of the resistance are some of the militants on the front lines, the defenders that are being arrested are queer people themselves, but also one of the people that's being groomed and will likely become a hereditary chief in the next probably year or so will be the first openly gay hereditary chief. So you're starting to see within the traditional system this move. I'd also note on the opposite side, in the tar sands, the first of the nations to break with the tar sands, and the tar sands are connected to these rare cancers. That community, the leader that actually was the first one, the elected chief of that community, was also the first openly gay elected chief in the country. So this leadership is often tied in those connections. In Florida, or in the South, if you look at the leadership of, this is shifting gears to more struggles around race, but Stop Cop City in Atlanta, the leadership in that movement has been largely queer, and it's been a lot of trans activists have played a really prominent role in talking about police violence. So You can see that also there. In Tallahassee, TCAC, which is the group there that's been organizing around police violence, has trans leadership as well. So increasingly we're seeing in these movements, the people that are connecting different forms of violence together have this at the center of their analysis.
Okay. I think Allie's probably exhausted from all these amazing questions and from standing in front of us for an hour and a half. So let's thank Allie for